What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. So the weather outside is still really bad, so I want to answer some of the comments I've been getting on my recent YouTube videos. And I've been getting a lot of comments about the type of line I use. And I know a few of you guys have noticed that I throw a lot of monofilament line. And there are a lot of misconceptions out there about monofilament line. And a lot of people believe that fluorocarbon is 10 times better than monofilament line, and you need to be throwing fluorocarbon all the time if you want to put fish in the boat and if you want to avoid break-offs. But that's definitely not the case, and I throw mono a lot of times, also throw a lot of braided line. And so today I wanted to walk you through what lines I use in different situations to hopefully save you some money so you don't have to buy a bunch of expensive fluorocarbon, and also make sure you're using the right line to match the situation you're in and the baits you're throwing to put more bass in the boat. So let's get into it. Before we jump into this video, I do want to preface this by saying that this video is a guide for new fishermen who are just learning about all the different types of lines and when and how to use them. And I know there's a lot of guys who are watching this video who have 20, 30, 40 years of fishing experience and been fishing longer than I've been alive even. And you have a lot of good ideas about which lines work best for you. And so I'm not trying to tell you that the way that you fish or the line that you use is wrong. I'm just putting out what I've found works for me so that hopefully some of the newer anglers can understand just some of the basics about which lines are good in which situations. And I have fished over 150 tournaments in my life and won on almost every level except for the Pro Tour level. So I do feel like I have enough experience to be able to give at least the basic guidelines on which fishing lines to use. So please don't go blast me in the comments if my opinion on fishing line doesn't line up with yours. There's a lot of ways to put fish in the boat and there's no one perfect solution. So with all that out of the way, let's get straight to my first type of fishing line I use, which is fluorocarbon. So first up we have fluorocarbon line, and this is pretty much the gold standard for tournament bass fishing. And it has really good abrasion resistance, it will sink, and it's super strong. And my favorite fluorocarbon line is Seaguar Invisex, and I normally throw this line anywhere from 8-pound test up to 25-pound test. And this Seaguar Invisex will cost between $20 and $30 per spool, and most of the good fluorocarbons are going to run you at least $20 per spool. And there are some cheaper fluorocarbon options out there that may only cost $8 to $12 per spool, but I've had a lot of bad experiences with these cheaper fluorocarbons. I'm not saying that Strand fluorocarbon specifically is bad, but this is one of their budget fluorocarbon lines, and so normally if the fluorocarbon is less than $20 per spool, normally I'll find that I break off a lot with this line and it just isn't as good as the higher end lines. And so I will pay up for more expensive fluorocarbon, especially if I'm fishing tournaments and want to make sure I put all of my fish in the boat. And because this fluorocarbon line is pretty expensive and I have to switch it out every 10 to 15 fishing trips, I only like to fish it in situations where I think it's absolutely necessary. And one of those situations is when I'm fishing baits that are fished deeper than 5 feet of water. And normally when I'm fishing a bait in more than 5 feet of water, it means I'm fishing in relatively clear water, let's say 1.5 feet of visibility or more. And normally these baits are going to be fished near the bottom or in suspended water columns. So for example, this football jig would be fished on the bottom in rocks and wood and grass in 5 feet or more of water, especially this 1/2 ounce size. And then you have this swim bait, which is a single swim bait that I'll fish for suspended bass in clear water when I have 2 to 5 feet of visibility and the fish are in 15 to 20 feet of water. And I'll also fish that fluorocarbon line on baits like a hair jig or a big 10-inch worm or a Carolina rig or really any bait that I'm fishing in deeper than 5 feet of water. And the reason I like to use fluorocarbon line with these baits is again because I'm normally fishing them in pretty clear water, 1.5 feet of visibility or more, and fluorocarbon is really hard to see in the water for the fish, nearly invisible, and that will get you a few extra bites on the water. And fluorocarbon also sinks, which is great for fishing a bait like a suspending swim bait where you're reeling it halfway down the water column, because it'll keep that bait a little bit deeper in the water and make it easier to keep that bait down there where the fish are. So between the nearly invisible qualities of fluorocarbon and the fact that it sinks, it makes it great for pairing with these baits. And I also always throw fluorocarbon line on my spinning reels. And I actually don't use straight fluorocarbon on my spinning reels. Instead, I'll use a 10-pound braided line as my main line, and I'll tie that to an 8 to 12 foot leader of fluorocarbon line with a modified Albright knot. And this just saves me a lot of money when I'm fishing spinning reels, because spinning reels will cause your line to get a lot of line twist, and I'll go through a spool of fluorocarbon after maybe 5 or 6 trips with a spinning rod if I use straight fluorocarbon. So this backing of 10-pound braided line works really well, and as long as you can tie that good connecting knot to your fluorocarbon leader, you should be good to go. And the reason I like this fluorocarbon line with my spinning reels is because this fluorocarbon is nearly invisible in the water. And this is great when you're fishing very pressured fish or in really clear bodies of water. And normally when I'm fishing a spinning reel, I'm targeting either super clear water or highly pressured fish. And so fluorocarbon is great because it's really subtle and stealthy in the water, and it will get you some extra bites in those tough fishing conditions. And one thing that y'all have maybe heard about guys doing is using braided line as the main line on their bait casters and tying it to a 10 to 20 foot fluorocarbon leader of anywhere from 10 to 20 pound test. And this setup gives you the best of both worlds kind of, because you'll have the invisibility of the fluorocarbon matched with the strength and abrasion resistance of the braided line. And it normally is a really good setup, especially if you're trying to save money, because you don't have to spool up your entire reel with fluorocarbon, so you'll save some line there. And then also the braided line will last a lot longer than that fluorocarbon because it won't get any memory and get twisted, so you can definitely save money doing that. But if you look at the Bassmaster Elite Series and the Major League Fishing Tour, you notice that a lot of guys don't use this setup with the braided line main line tied to a fluorocarbon leader. And that's because whenever you have to use this setup, you have to tie a connecting knot between the fluorocarbon and the braid. And every time you tie a knot, it creates another potential point of failure. And I've actually tried this setup and broken off 3 or 4 times in tournaments. And I was loving it at first because it saved me a bunch of money and I thought it was great. But even though I was tying a really good FG knot that I tested on knot machines, stuff like that, it's one of those things where there's always gonna be human error in there. And so I've actually gone away from using the braided line on my main line for my bait caster and just gone to straight fluoro, especially if there's money on the line. But again, that's just my opinion, and if you are using this setup right now and you're having a lot of success with it, stick with it. I'm not telling you that what you're doing is wrong, I'm just letting you know my personal experience with this setup. And also, if you're just fun fishing, it's a great way to save money because you're not as worried about breaking off fish. So if you're okay with losing a few fish or breaking off a few baits, then definitely try it out because you will save money over the course of a year. Next up, let's talk about braided line. So the other type of line I like to use is braided line. And I've mentioned that I use braided line as the backing for my spinning reels, and also that I don't like to use it as a backing on my bait casters and then tie a fluorocarbon leader to it. So what situations do I actually use braided line? Well, in general, when I'm fishing braided line, I'm normally fishing it around really heavy cover or on some of my top water baits. And my go-to braided line is a 65-pound braid, and I get it in the green color, and I get a 1,500 yard spool of this braid because I don't go through very much of it. I may only change the braid on my reels once a year, or if I'm fishing around like any kind of metal and my line gets torn up. And normally this big spool of braid will last me 2 to 3 years, and this braid won't go bad if you just leave it in storage for a long time. So I would highly recommend buying braid in bulk, especially if you think you're gonna be fishing around heavy cover a lot. So my first application for braided line is when I'm flipping baits into heavy cover, like bushes, around lily pads, or in heavy grass. And braided line is great when you're flipping around heavy cover because that braid will cut through lily pad stems or grass or even small limbs when you set the hook, and helps you get those big fish out of that heavy cover. And also when you're fishing around that heavy cover, those bass won't be able to see the braided line even though it's really visible, because it will blend in with a lot of the branches or the grass or lily pad stems that you're fishing. And so you don't have to worry about the fish being spooked by the line, and it also gives you that extra strength to pull those fish out of that heavy cover. And the other time I use braided line is when I'm fishing non-treble hook topwater baits, like a spro frog or a buzzbait. And the reason I like to fish braided line on these topwater baits is because normally I'm fishing these two baits around some sort of cover, so it'll help me pull fish away from the cover quickly and get them in the boat without a problem. And the other reason is that braided line floats, and it will keep these topwater baits on top of the water and won't affect their action. And if you fish fluorocarbon line on these topwater baits, a lot of times that fluorocarbon line will sink under the water as you're reeling these baits in, and it will cause these baits to nose down into the water and affect their action. So I always throw braided line on my non-treble hook topwater baits. Now what everyone came here for, the big game. So last but not least is monofilament line, and I love fishing monofilament. I fished it since I was a little kid, and I've caught so many good fish on it, and I think it's definitely getting a bad rap in the bass fishing community, especially after fluorocarbon line became so popular, but I still throw monofilament all the time. So I want to talk about the times that I throw mono and the applications you can get away with it, because it's definitely a lot cheaper than fluorocarbon, and it actually has some properties that make it better than fluorocarbon in a lot of situations. So first up, what type of monofilament line do I like to fish? Well, for the majority of my fishing applications, I use Stren heavy cover monofilament line. And this line was discontinued a long time ago, but I still have a ton of line left from when it was sponsored by Stren years back. And this is a really great monofilament line, but there's a lot of comparable lines out nowadays. There's the good old Stren Original. You also have Berkeley or Trilene Big Game, which is really good and it's super cheap. And I know I got some comments in my last video when I talked about using Big Game, and people were saying in California everyone hates Big Game, but I know a lot of guys here in Arkansas that catch a lot of good fish on Big Game, and again, it's super cheap. You can get a really big spool line for like no money, and it works just as well as pretty much any other mono on the market. So in general, I fish almost all of my moving baits on monofilament line, from lipless crankbaits to spinner baits to jerk baits to treble hook topwater baits to deep diving crankbaits, even Alabama rigs. I'll throw them on monofilament line. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that I'm normally fishing these moving baits in less than 5 feet of water. And so when I'm fishing in 5 feet of water or less, either I'm gonna be fishing around some sort of cover, or the water is gonna be pretty stained up, less than 1.5 feet of visibility. And fishing around heavy cover, those bass won't be able to tell that you're fishing monofilament or braid or fluoro, so it doesn't matter anyways. And then if you're fishing less than 1.5 feet of visibility, those fish can't see the line anyways either. And another reason why you can get away with throwing moving baits on monofilament line is because normally you're going to be reeling these baits in at a pretty good pace, and a lot of times these bass won't be able to distinguish that line when the bait is moving by them really quickly. They're just going to hone in on the bait itself and have a reaction strike to that lure. So unlike a bottom bait that you're fishing slowly in 10 or 15 feet of water where the bass have time to analyze that bait and look for anything unnatural about the bait, a lot of times you're going to be reeling these moving baits right past the fish's face, and they're just going to react to it. And they're not going to have time to observe the bait and analyze it to see if there's any kind of irregularities with it, like let's say seeing the monofilament line in front of the bait. So in general, when you're fishing moving baits, it doesn't make much difference whether you're fishing fluorocarbon or monofilament line for that reason. And another reason why I like to fish monofilament line, especially on my moving baits with treble hooks, is because monofilament line has stretch, unlike braid. So that means when you set the hook on a fish with monofilament line, the line will stretch a little bit. And this is really good when you're fishing light wire treble hook baits like this little flat side crankbait, because a lot of times if you have braided line or fluorocarbon line when you're fishing these crankbaits, because that line has no stretch, you may actually pull the hooks out of that fish's mouth. And I actually find that I land a lot more bass on my light wire treble hook baits when I'm fishing monofilament line as opposed to fishing fluorocarbon for that exact reason. And you may be a little bit worried by that line stretch, especially if you're fishing a single hook bait like the spinner bait. But remember, I'm normally fishing these baits in less than 5 feet of water, and as long as you're using a heavy action rod or a medium heavy action rod with these spinner baits or any other single hook bait, you can still drive the hook home really easily with that monofilament line. It's just a problem if you're fishing in 20 or 30 feet of water with mono, because that stretch can affect your hook set if you're fishing really deep with that monofilament line. But there are a couple applications where I'll actually throw fluorocarbon with my moving baits rather than monofilament line. So the first moving bait that I like to throw fluorocarbon line on rather than monofilament is a suspending jerk bait when I'm fishing it in the wintertime in really clear water. And the reason for that is because I'm normally letting this bait sit in the water for 5, 6, 7 seconds at a time, and the fish have time to examine the bait. And a lot of times they might be able to see that monofilament line out here in front of the bait, and it may spook the fish. And also, that fluorocarbon line will sink and it'll help get this jerkbait a little bit deeper, which is good when the water temperatures are really cold. But if I'm fishing in really dirty water, or if I'm working the bait quickly, I'll still fish monofilament line on my jerkbait. It's only when I'm letting it pause for a long time in that really clear water. And the other time I like to throw fluorocarbon line on my moving baits over monofilament line is when I'm fishing a single hooked moving bait deeper than 5 feet of water. So for example, in the springtime, I like to throw a bladed jig in deep grass in 7, 8, 9 feet of water, or in the center of a ditch in 10 or 15 feet of water. And in that case, I'll be throwing fluorocarbon line because that fluorocarbon will sink and it'll help get that bait deeper in the water and stay in the strike zone longer near the bottom. And if I'm throwing that monofilament, again, that line will float, which will keep that bait higher in the water column. I'll also get a worse hook set on this bait when it's deeper with that monofilament as opposed to a better hook set with fluorocarbon because it has no stretch. But you'll notice that I said single hook baits deeper than 5 feet of water. And so that doesn't apply to my deep diving crankbaits or medium diving crankbaits. And whenever I'm fishing a deep diving crankbait or a medium diving crankbait that dives more than 5, 6 feet deep, I'm still gonna be throwing monofilament line. And about 10 years ago, when deep cranking first started to become a really popular technique, guys said that you always had to throw fluorocarbon line on your deep diving crankbaits to help maximize the depth of that crankbait. And that was definitely the case when your deepest diving crankbait was a DD22 or a Strike King 6XD. But now there are a lot more deep diving crankbaits on the market, and the 6XD isn't the deepest crankbait out there anymore. Now you have baits like the 8XD or the 10XD that will dive 20 to 25 feet deep, even on 15-pound monofilament line. And so I've actually switched away from using fluorocarbon on my deep diving crankbaits, and I only throw 10 or 12-pound monofilament line. And I've actually found that I've increased my landing ratios because that line has more stretch, which helps me avoid pulling the hooks out of those fish's mouth. And that monofilament is still super strong, and I can still pull these crankbaits out of brush piles, stuff like that, and never have any problems with break-offs. And if I do find myself in a situation where I'm fishing a 6XD in, let's say, 18 feet of water and I can't hit the bottom, instead of going to 10 or 12-pound fluorocarbon line from the mono, I'll just go to a bigger crankbait. I'll just go to an 8XD or a 10XD, and then I'll be able to hit that water column. So I've definitely gone away from fluorocarbon deep cranking just to save money, and also I find that the extra stretch actually helps me put more fish in the boat. And last but not least, I like to fish all of my treble hook topwater baits with monofilament line as well. Again, because that line has stretch and because it floats, which will make sure you get the best action out of these topwater baits. And a lot of guys do like to throw braided line on their treble hook topwater baits because normally they're making long casts with these baits, especially if they're fishing for schooling bass, and it'll help you get a better hookup at the end of a long cast. But what I found is that sometimes when those fish get to the boat and surge at the boat, a lot of times they can pull the hooks out of their mouth because that braid has no stretch. And when I'm fishing monofilament, I don't have that problem because the line will stretch. But there are advantages to throwing the braid on your topwater treble hook baits, so it's something that if you're okay with the potential of losing fish at the boat, you can definitely get away with it. But in my experience, I just go with mono because I have the best success with it. But again, it's all personal preference there. So guys, that was a quick video. Actually, it was kind of a long video on all the different types of fishing lines I use and the techniques and situations I use them in. So I hope you learned something from this video and maybe have a better idea of which lines you should be using next time you're out in the lake. And so if you enjoyed the video, hit like and subscribe down below. Leave a comment if you have any questions about what I was talking about. And also share the video with a friend if you think it would help them pick better lines and also save some money over the course of the year by using that big game. Big game all the way. So anyways, hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.